What is up? What is up? What is up? Welcome to the Mitch Davis Show. I am joined by a legend, a Florida Gators media legend, an SEC football legend, a man that needs no introduction in the Southeastern Conference, Mr. Buddy Martin. Thank you so much for coming on the Mitch Davis Show. How are you doing? And are you ready for football?
Well, in reverse order, hell yes, I'm ready for football, and let's do it. And I'm doing okay. And thank you for the kind words. Glad to meet you and want to pick your brain and find out what's going on in your world. And because this whole thing with college football, especially SEC, is kind of sort of sideways and kind of sort things out. So help me with that, will you?
Well, let's try to make sense of the offseason that the SEC obviously had. Obviously, everybody knows we're going to talk a little Florida, but I want to ask you your opinion from the outside looking in. Jimbo Fisher, Nick Saban, how much of that was legitimate and how much of that was for show?
I think it's legitimate. I think they were really kind of sparring a little bit and kind of ticked off, and think of two guys playing in a pickup basketball game, which they did a lot. And you get fights with each other and you're trying to keep the other guy from getting an advantage. And as Nick said later, this is nothing new. We used to have these all the time, staff meeting arguments and basketball games, whatever. So, but they were really ticked off. And I can't blame either guy, oddly enough, because on one hand, Nick Saban didn't say anything that really wasn't true. It's just how he said it and the accusatory tone of how he said it. And it did imply that A&M was cheating, which under the old rules would have been. But I talked to Steve Spurrier about it, and Steve said, well, nothing he said was wrong, But I understand how Jimbo got upset about it because he got called out and called some names and what have you. And Jimbo went after him. He got real feisty about it, and it was great theater. I loved it. But, sometimes it takes something like that for people to see the true side of these guys. And listen, we know they're all hyper competitive. We know that they disagree on some things. So we don't get the chance to get inside that sometimes and see what it's really like. And so this was a public deal. And we got to hear it all and see it all. And it was great theater.
You mentioned Steve Spurrier, and I had the distinct honor. You've gotten to meet him several times, but I had a very distinct honor and privilege to have the opportunity to meet him. He came up here to the Autism Liberty Bowl, Distinguished Citizen Award here in Memphis, got to have him on the podcast. How would you think Steve Spurrier, I asked him, and he kind of gave me a little Steve Spurrier talk, but how do you think he would have responded back to, let's say, a Nick Saban or Jimbo Fisher in that situation?
Oh, it's hard to say. He'd had something to say about it. Hit most of his comments. If you look over at is it this shoulder? Is this shoulder there? There's a book called Head Ball Coach. I wrote Coach Spurrier about 5 years ago. Known him a long time and covered him. He was a player. That's how old I am. But the thing about Spurrier is when you feel his jabs the most is when you're not expecting them. And many of his controversial comments were made in the off season, or what Steve refers to as talking season, which, by the way, he said that I should have trademarked that phrase, talking season. And I think he would have had plenty to say, but his real great quotes were during he was speaking to the alumni during the off season, the Free Shoes University and all those great comments and spelling the Citrus Bowl with the U and a T and so on and so forth. But I love Spurrier. He was bold, and he would look you in the eye and tell you how he thought about it. And he did have his way of getting even with you. And I'm sure he'd have held his own in that match. So I can't think of a quote suitable enough, but he would have come out with something. And first of all, and there aren't too many guys who've tried him. It's like a gunslinger. You got to try a guy, right? Those that did usually wound up on the wrong side of that. He loved to attack Ray Goff in Georgia because Goff opened his mouth one time and he made him pay. And Spurrier he's that way. He will get vindictive on you. If you say something across him, he won't let you up. So no, I don't think I can say other than Ray Goff that there's one guy Well, Bobby Bowden, you couldn't call it a fight because Bobby wouldn't fight back, and and Steve said some pretty mean things about Bobby, and Bobby finally at the end of his life, Steve went up to see him when he was dying. Sort of had bygones, but he got bygones. But Steve will hold a grudge, and he had one on Bowden who had a hard time beating. But other than that, although he's had a few bouts, he is held in high esteem by most all coaches, including Saban, who, by the way, had him out to give an award just last year. And so as much as he ran his mouth, as much as he was poked fun at people and had fun with them and whatever, he really didn't have any real enemies. And I don't think Jimbo and Nick are enemies. They're just old friends who had a little difference of opinion, a big difference of opinion. But Spurrier would have found his way, without a doubt, to get his pound of flesh.
Before we jump into this season, obviously, I want to ask you a question about being a fan. Obviously, you're a Florida man, and it's no secret that I'm a Kentucky fan. There is no secret about it. I wear it proudly. How do you think that approach helps you also in your journalistic perspective? Because as a Florida man, you've got an interesting take on the Florida Gators. You're very objective about them, very honest about them, just like I am with Kentucky. What would you recommend for young people who are fans of a university but who are scared to wear a Florida hat or wear a Kentucky hat here at say?
I haven't until recently done that. I call myself a journalist, and I have been for almost a half a century, and I took great pride in my independence. I had my battles with Florida people. I mean, I went to the wall with some people and coaches at Florida. I've written about them a little bit. I didn't try to make myself the story. It's just I found out some things and I wrote about them, and I stood my ground, and I went toe to toe with some people, and I tried to call it like it was. A lot of Gator fans got upset with me, but that's kind of comes with. But I will say I have been more embracing them in recent years because it's acceptable now. I don't write a column for a newspaper. I have an online column as owner of Gatorbait. If I could just plug it, GatorbaitMedia.com. And I do a weekly column, a weekly magazine, and we don't pull punches. Even though I was good friends with Steve Spurrier and wrote his book, I had my disagreements with Steve. And I would say this: it's okay to say where your allegiance lies. The question is, though, can you push back when the time comes to write the story and say, all bets are off? I may have friends, I may bleed orange and blue, but I got to write it like it really is here. It may pain you to do that, but you got to do it. You got to push back and say, let me take the mental approach here and say, okay, like the old story, the old cliche. There's more than two sides to the story, there's three, and you got to find those sides and represent them when you have to, and don't get duped by people. Now, the young guys are smart today. They don't get duped too often. They push back. Here's the thing, though. Don't miss the opportunity to build relationships. That's the greatest thing for me over the last 50 years is the great relationships I've had, even with people that I've had to write bad things about. Those relationships are wonderful, and you'll build respect that way. But when you talk about a team, and I got a couple of kids that work for me, remember when you talk about your team, you don't say we. I have a couple of kids who say, oh, we did this. At the time I say, I didn't see you lined up out there on the field. Did you play the game? You're not playing the game. It's not we. It may be your team and our team, but it's not we. So have a modicum of distance. Be willing to push back and say, let me be real honest about this. Here's what I think I know. And then write what you think or say what you think you know. That would be my only advice.
And, I think that's something that I'll admit I take a lot of pride in that because, I got to interview Keith Carter this time last year and interview the Ole Miss athletics director. And I told him, I said, Keith, you know me, I'm a Kentucky fan, but I have such a respect for what you have built at Ole Miss. And I have such a respect for, what all these guys have built all across the SEC. And I think that's what separates a lot of the journalists nowadays is, I have a respect for what Rocky Top is doing up there in Tennessee, and I think it's so cool to get to meet guys like yourself. But jumping over a little bit, obviously Florida's got to
– respect is – excuse me, Mitch. Respect is absolutely the right word. Right word.
And I think that that's something that's really cool. I've gotten to learn, go to the SEC baseball tournaments here, cover my first SEC tournament, get to meet some of the guys from the other places. I got to meet guys from Arkansas and Alabama and Auburn that I never knew. Of course,
Right.
Rob Brown and Rob's a good friend of mine and the mentor, and he's kind of poured into me. And I've started to embrace Auburn a little bit and embrace Ole Miss. I was happy for what Mike Bianco did this season in baseball. Man, I feel like I'm a part
what
of
a story. What a great story.
That was great. But looking over at Florida, obviously new head coach this year, Billy Napier comes in. Talk about the excitement at Florida right now, because it really feels like the Florida fans are excited, but some people on the outside looking in have questions about the hiring of Billy Napier.
I don't think there are any questions about the hiring. That was a solid A+. I don't think the people I talk to don't have a problem. I haven't heard one real Gator fan I know say, gosh, I wish we wouldn't have hired him. I think the hiring was really the right way to go. And the second thing is, if you listen to the people who know and you talk to people who know, I have friends in the media. My friend Matt Moscano out of Baton Rouge told me 2 days before he was hired, Florida's going to get a great coach in Billy Napier. They're going to hire him. He says a lot of people in Louisiana kind of wish the LSU would have hired him. And, Billy had chances to go other places and didn't. And so the real danger I talk about is not that. I talk about being careful. Don't get your heart broken. I was a huge proponent of Dan Mullen being hired when he got hired. I've known Dan casually for a lot of years. I knew him when he coached for Urban Meyer, who I know pretty well. And Dan came in, and the first thing we thought, oh boy, going to be able to score some points finally. That was a big thing. And he did, but we found out really that what looked like progress really wasn't that much progress. And people fell in love with Dan Mullen and got their hearts broken because in the third year, he fizzled out. He began fizzling out, a lot of missing pieces, bad judgments, not good recruiting. And it kind of, people feel like he kind of walked away at the last minute. When he lost to Alabama, I said, I'm done. I'm going to do something else. Let me take my $13 million and leave here. So that's about a bad taste in people's mouths, which is unfortunate because the first 2 years were exciting with Mullen and people started to believe it a little bit. The problem is, now this is you've heard that quote from Billy Napier, scared money don't make money. That's the one they all quote on him, which is a great quote. Well, mine is, don't fall in love on the first date. Let's at least let him coach a few games before we either make a judgment, good or bad. Like somebody wrote the other day, my friend David Whitley down in Gainesville, when everybody got upset at Billy because he didn't get some of the recruits, got angry and upset, David wrote, well, we ought to let Napier start his era before we end it. And so let's wait and see. I'm pretty positive about it, but I'm going to have to wait and see. And I will tell you this, I don't know if can think of a bigger opening game for the Florida Gators than playing Utah here on Labor Day weekend.
3 more questions I have for you. I want to ask you about this season. Obviously, what are your expectations? We know some of the names, but what are some of those outside names that could be sleepers on this Florida roster?
Well, I'd like to think of it as rooms and judge as groups. And there's some young players that, are not necessarily starters that I think a lot of us individuals, and we've interviewed 20 consecutive weeks of interviewing Florida players on a special thing we do with Gator Collective. And we've gotten to know some of them. And some of them are, Derek Wingo is a young linebacker who's just the highest quality person, that in my opinion is going to be a leader. Who's going to step up and lead? Brenton Cox is going to have a big year. And there's no question about that. And the fact they've got Ventrell Miller coming back, he's a huge piece of that. The secondary, and you haven't heard any of the names, are going to be pretty good. They got 2 really good coaches back there, obviously. And they got guys, including the architect of LSU's DBU, they're really good coaches coming there. And the guys that I look forward to, we all know about Anthony Richardson. I'm really high on Anthony Richardson. I know all the downsides. He's got an injury and whatever. I laugh when I see a poll that says top, ranking the top 8 quarterbacks in the SEC, and Anthony Richardson is 8th. That's laughable. But yet, if you go to Vegas and bet on the Heisman Trophy winner, he's ranked 3rd. And nobody really knows him yet. He's got great skills. And I like the fact that he and Coach Napier are on the same page. If we can believe what we hear from the players we talk to, as they tell me, we got some ballers here. All right. We got some ballers on this team. So I could give you the free deep lineup. Let's just say, however, that their quarterback is solid. They got a good, solid backup in Miller. They got 3 running backs they can go to, including the Montreal Johnson who transferred. They got an offensive line that's much better than people expected. And by the way, Rob Sale came from the New York Giants to be the offensive coordinator. And guess what he likes to do? Run the football. And they're built to hopefully run. Their tight end position is in question some, but I think they got a really good room of good tight ends. They haven't got, they don't have an all-world player at tight end. They're probably missing a receiver. They picked up one from Southern Cal, which Ricky Pearsall, who's got some speed. And a couple of guys are poised for big years. And I think one of them will be Trent Whittemore, the wide receiver who played the slot. So I think they're solid on offense. The question becomes, can they run the football? So defensively, they're going to be really pretty good. And here's the key. They're not going to make the mistakes they made last year, i.e. Kentucky when they had 9 penalties on offense. I think 8 of them were for a long snap count. Couldn't snap the ball. On defense, they couldn't line up. That's not going to happen. So I think overall, I think Billy Napier, unlike Mullen, is more of a CEO type guy. He's provided them with the things they need, the amenities he's given that program team. They're all loving for doing that, and I think they're poised and ready. Now, having said that, they're not going to beat Georgia. Okay, I understand that. Who is going to beat Georgia? Maybe one team. So I think you're looking at a season, and I'm not ready to pick a number yet, but it could go anywhere from 7 to 9 in there someplace in terms of wins. They got some tough outs. So I'm pretty positive on it. But again, I'm not falling in love with the first 8. I want to see what Billy Napier can do after he's coached at least one game.
I want to ask you about one of the most controversial topics of the offseason for both Florida and Georgia. Obviously, we heard of the SEC media days, and you put out a tweet about 23 hours ago talking about moving the Florida-Georgia game from Jacksonville, and you talked about, all right, well, if we're going to do that and then move the SEC championship to Tampa, Nashville, New Orleans, Dallas, what do you think is next for the world's largest cocktail party? And do you think that they're going to move it out of Jacksonville? Why or why not?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked me. I just hung up the phone with a guy who's worked both sides of the fence, Greg McGarity, the former athletic director of Georgia and the former associate athletic director of Florida, who now works for the city of Jacksonville. We talked about this game, what it means. Financially, it's a bonanza because they get paid. Not only they get paid the game and TV revenues, they get the city of Jacksonville pays them $1 million each. And what I got tired of hearing, I heard my friend Paul Feinbaum say it yesterday. He said, well, it's just Florida, Georgia. All we know is we go there and they have a game and we go broadcast on asphalt. And, it's there's no reason why they can't play the game home and home. And then someone called and said, well, how about Texas, Oklahoma? Look at the great tradition they got. And Paul says, oh, yeah, well, they need to keep that. What? Well, since when is that bigger? They're both going to be SEC teams too. I've been to Texas, Oklahoma. I know it's a big game. I understand what goes on there. I've also been to 1,000 Florida, Georgia games, all right? If you're not around it, haven't been to it, and Paul went to his first one 5 years ago, you don't quite get it. It's not, and the argument that it's better for recruiting, that Kirby says, we lose a weekend of recruiting. We can't have this. Look, I understand recruiting is important, but what if one year someone said, well, Christmas is getting in the way of recruiting. Let's cancel Christmas this year. And the traditions of college football are being thrown, a baby and the bathwater are being thrown out together. And I finally decided to draw the line on it, and I called them out yesterday on a tweet and said, okay, we're going to play that game. We're going to start saying you got to have a home and home. then let's talk about the SEC championship game in Atlanta. How come Georgia gets that advantage? 50 miles down the road. Maybe I'll start moving it around out to Dallas and then New Orleans and Nashville and Tampa. How you like them apples? Oh no, we can't do that. We can't do that. So I just fired back, and I decided I'm nobody. I'm just a guy here in Florida who's been around a few years, and I got an opinion or two. I do a show and write a column, but for what little I have, the one guy who listens to me out there or reads me, I'm not letting up on this. If you think for 1 minute that's not heresy to say, oh, we don't want to, let's have a home and home because it's better for all. It's not better for all concerned. It's not better for the game. And you ask the Georgia people, they'll tell you they take their vacations this fall break. They come down here, they go to Jekyll Isle, Sea Isle, Fernandez Beach, San Augustine, Crescent, all of them down. They party for a week and they love it. But the coach says, no, it's a recruiting weekend. I'm sorry. I can't equate everything in life with recruiting.
I will say, being around the Egg Bowl, I've been around the Egg Bowl now, gosh, going on probably 8-9 years. Yeah, I'm friends with Coach Hugh Freeze. So when he freezes down there, I get to go to the Egg Bowl a lot. There's a difference in the traditions, and I've never been to the world's largest cocktail party. My boss is a Georgia grad, so he's been telling me, hey, you need to come down to go see the game. And of course, I've got the Florida people inviting me down as well. I've never been. But for me, it's always that game that I look forward to, and I look forward to watching you guys go to war, and go to war out there in Jacksonville. And I think moving that rivalry game is ridiculous,
Huge mistake. Huge. And Greg said a while ago, we've done this once in 94 and 95, okay, where you played home and home. It's not even the same. One of the big things is the visitors only get 5,000 seats. At Florida, Georgia, when one team scores, one side goes crazy, the other team scores, the other 40,000 people on each side. And that's what makes it so unbelievable. The sea of red, the sea of orange and blue, they just erupt like that. And there's so many reasons why, if they start saying, well, we got to change everything to fit recruiting weekends, I'm sorry, I ain't buying that.
Last question I have for you, obviously, I've always loved asking people this question that have been around the industry for so long and, have the stories that you do. And obviously, I want to have you back on, and we're going to not just talk about the football team, but I wanted to actually talk about the history of Florida football, because, your name pops up in those lists that say, hey, this is a historian of Florida football. And I really want to pick your brain down the line, maybe in a couple of weeks, and we'll do a part 2 and we'll just talk about the history. But I want to ask you about this point blank. What does the University of Florida mean to you and your family? Obviously, you've been around a long time, but what does it mean to you?
Nobody's ever asked me that question. And I'll tell you how it really means to me. I went to school there. I met my wife there. I met her on the corner of University and 13th when a drive-in restaurant, when I saw a friend walking down the street with her. She was from Miami. She'd been in town a week. I met this beautiful young woman that I thought I would never have a chance of dating her or whatever. And I met her there, and I married her. We had 4 kids. We've had over a half century together, man and wife. And everything I ever learned to do in newspapers, I learned from them. I was a young writer, a sports editor. Right out of there, my professors were fantastic. They taught me about it. And I said, buddy, you're going to be an editor someday. You're going to be an editor, they would tell me. And they gave me confidence. Of course, I love the sports side of it. I love covering the games. I love going to the games. And I've been lucky enough to come back after being gone 30 years and be living in Colorado and New York and what have you in those markets, and get a chance to come back here now. And I've been here for 15 years living in my home in Ocala and covering Florida football. So I'll die with my boots on. And I love that. And it means a lot to our family and me. And it's been an honor and a pleasure to be educated by the University of Florida and to be called a Gator.
One little follow-up, and I like to have a little follow-up to that. But I want to ask you, though, what is the difference? Just quickly talk about the difference in football across the country. Obviously, I'm from the South, and you're from the South, and down here it does just mean more. Talk about just following football from outside the Southeastern footprint.
Well, let me just tell you this. I worked in New York. I was sports editor of New York Daily News many years ago. And of course, they wouldn't know football from a hockey puck, most of them up there. And there was no real great college football. There was Syracuse upstate, which I never went to. There was Army, which is a great tradition. There's Penn State, which is where most of my guys love to cover. But college football wasn't in the conversation on a daily basis. It just wasn't. And I realized that when I got there. Then I moved to Denver, where football was big and mostly all Broncos. And they said, "Where do you go to Folsom Field and Boulder? See what that's like." I go up there. There's 45,000 people in the stands. They're playing, I don't know, Oklahoma State, somebody, you know. I thought, this is college football? Where I come from, it's 80,000 at least in the stands. You know, if they think they got football, they ain't got football here in the Big Eight. It's back there in the SEC, and I knew that instantly. So yeah, I found out there was a big difference in the two. I did cover a lot of great games. I went to Texas, Oklahoma. I went to you know Southern Cal, Nebraska, etc. But coming back here at the time I did, I was living here when Steve Spurrier arrived, and I left that same year and moved out to Colorado. But because of my job, I was able to be off most falls. I started coming back here regularly in '92 when Steve was taking over. In fact, Steve and I were scheduled to do a book that summer in '92. And we corresponded with an email and back and forth. And finally, I said, "Okay, you ready to go? Let's go. I'm going to come down there." He backed out. He said, "I got too good of a team this year. We're going to be top down. I don't want to distract." I said, "Okay. All right." So I said, "I'm going to do a book anyway." So I did a little tiny paperback book called Down with Old Gators Play. And actually, it was so good, I did another one. I did it, unfortunately. I'm always good at writing the wrong year. I wrote the first one before they won the National Championship, and the second one the year after. I never did quite get it synced together. But I started writing Florida football books back in the 80s, and I've done several since then. And one day, 6 years ago, I was doing my show on the radio. My phone rang, a cell phone. It was Coach Spurrier. I was in a break. He says, "You got a second?" I said, "Coach, I'm on a break." He said, "I just want to say, remember that book we were going to write?" I said, "You mean 23 or 4 years?" "Yeah." He says, "How'd you like to do it now?" Okay. So off we went, and we wrote The Head Ball Coach, which I'm proud to say was a New York Times bestseller. And so, yeah, I've got a lot invested emotionally here in many ways. It's been great for me. I've been really honored and thrilled to be a part of it. I love my man, Coach Spurrier, and I'm excited to see where this is going to go. And I think we're going to have a pretty exciting season one way or the other this year in Gainesville. And I really like Billy Napier.
He is Buddy Martin and author of one of my all-time favorite books, The Head Ball Coach there. I read that as a tradition of mine. I read that, the Paul Feinbaum book and the Clay Travis book. I read all three of those starting a month before the season kicks off. So
wow.
It's a great honor to finally interview. Let us know where they can find all of your amazing work, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Yeah, if you're interested, if you're a Gator fan, if you're not like good writing, which we have, we own Gator Baseball. We're a little boutique. We're not a big company. We have some really good writers. It's GatorBaitMedia.com. You can sign up for it. There's several plans. If you want to buy it, try it, whatever, for a month, try that. And I'm on the air Monday through Thursday night at 9 p.m. On the Buddy Martin Show. Just Google Buddy Martin Show, Facebook Live, 9 to 10. We have great guests, including your friend Rob Brown every now and then. And tonight we're going to talk about Tennessee's mess, and John Adams, the columnist of Knoxville News Sentinel, about what in the world happened in Knoxville.
I'm definitely going to have to be tuning into that. Thank you so much for coming on the Mitch Davis Show.
Thank you for having me, Mitch. We'll do it again.